I think we can probably start.
Yeah, I don't see anybody else waiting right now in the
Okay, perfect.
waiting room.
All right. Well, I would like to introduce Dr. Thomas Hennick-Kling. He is a friend of Michael's, actually, and that has volunteered to help us with our Wines of the West presentation and help me kind of bring in the presidency with a social hour that that we thought would be a whole lot of fun. So I definitely did bring the wine, and I looked at some of the different bottles that he suggested and that we sent out a little while ago. So I was able to get this one, which is really close to one of his suggestions. It's a Syrah from Hedges Family Winery, which I heard was kind of popular in the area that he was talking about in the Columbia Valley in Washington. So with that, thank you so much for joining us, for doing this for us very much, Thomas, and take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for your interest in wines of the West. I'll give a very brief introduction to it. Obviously, there would be a lot to cover if we look at all the wine in the West, which would be all of these areas here. All these areas shaded in purple here are what's called American viticultural areas. Those are registered, defined grape growing regions, and they're registered with the American Federal Tax and Trade Bureau. It doesn't mean that you can't grow grapes outside of these areas, but you cannot use the name of the particular grape growing area. It just would be Oregon or Washington or California in that case. The size of these AVAs, American Viticultural Areas, on the map is quite deceiving. It looks like Oregon and Washington grow a lot more grapes than California. It's not so. I think everybody knows that obviously California is the big one. California grows about 10 times more grapes than Washington State, Washington State being number 2. And actually Oregon State is number 3 in terms of wine grape production. And they're about half, a little bit more than half of what Washington State is. A lot of wine raters make a reference to where we are on what parallel in the world to compare. It helps to compare regions. And the parallel really is important for the amount of light, sunshine that we get, or light we get at particular times of the year. Obviously in the summer, in the Northern Hemisphere, we get more than areas further south. So we're right in that area, as you can see, in Washington, with close to the Northern Rhone, Burgundy, Northern Italy. But also if you were to travel to the very far north of Washington State, you would be up at about where Germany grows its famous Riesling. So it's quite an area to cover. And down here on the border with Oregon, we'd be, in the Northern Rhone. So this is important in terms of light that we get during the growing season. The other aspect that's important, of course, in growing wine grapes and being able to do it, and also more so the types of grapes we can grow and the quality of wine we can get, has to do with how much heat accumulation the plant sees during the growing and the ripening period, really. So growers look at the period between April and September, when April would be flowering, and in September, well, we actually harvest into October and sometimes into November. But traditionally April, September, they sum up the amount of days above a base temperature of 10 degrees Celsius here over this period. And that gives you an idea of how warm a particular site or growing region is. And that can tell you which grape cultivars would fit well into that kind of climate and which ones might not fit. So it gives you a nice comparison between California and the Pacific Northwest. Much of the California wine growing area you can see is in red and dark red, much warmer than what we have. We do have some areas though in Washington State, here near the Tri-Cities and just north of there, which are also quite warm. They're in that highest warm region, but much of it is cooler. You see more of the green and even some blue colors. So that's just for comparison. We are in general a bit cooler, especially during the night times. Jumping right into Washington, and really as an example of what the geography does to our ability to grow different kinds of grapes. So again, we are at that 46th latitude, which is just north of the Oregon border. Of course, we have the Columbia River here. It doesn't flow backward, even though I make it look like this. It actually comes out of Canada here and winds its way all the way through Eastern Washington and then along the border to Astoria here. The biggest, most important wine production area in Washington State is here in Eastern Washington. It's called the Columbia Valley AVA. And it's this large area that could be, for the most part, grown in terms of temperature, winter lows, but the critical thing that all this area needs is supplemental irrigation. There's not enough precipitation in that whole area of Eastern Washington. That's anywhere from these mountains east to grow wine grapes sustainably. This area, of course, on the west side of Washington State receives plenty of rain over the course of the year, but there's even periods in the summer when there's not enough rain and these vineyards would need supplemental irrigation too. And then within Eastern Washington, these AVAs, they try to group different areas with somewhat different characteristics by delineating them. So there's the Yakima Valley, which was the first AVA, sub-AVA, or the first AVA actually in Washington State, following most of the Yakima River that comes from the Cascade Mountains, flows into the Columbia here in Richland in the Tri-Cities. The other important valley, or well-known valley, is here, Walla Walla. There's a small river coming out of the Walla Walla Valley and flows here into the Columbia. Some of these warmer areas that I'm hinted at is like Red Mountain here and the Wahluke Slope. And then some areas in the Horse Heaven Hills are actually quite warm, similar to some of the warmer areas in California. So overall, there's a lot of diversity. Rain, I mentioned we need supplemental irrigation to grow wine grapes in Eastern Washington. And also to some degree in Western Washington and like in the Oregon Willamette Valley, which is just south of here, closer to the coast. We get lots of rain right on the coast, of course. This is over 6 meters of rain, way more than we want. That's actually a temperate rainforest here on the Olympic Peninsula. There's quite a pronounced rain shadow right on the other side of the mountains. The rain, you see, rainfall drops down by 6-fold and more. And that actually creates some pretty good conditions for wine grape growing. But overall, the temperature during the growing season is quite cool. So that limits what kind of grapes we can grow there. Here in the eastern side, on the east side of these Cascade Mountains, we see much less rain. we get snow, hopefully lots of snow in the winter, that provides water during the summer irrigation period. But here in the east, it's only about 1,500 to 2,500, 250 millimeter of precipitation. There are some areas way here on the eastern edge of Walla Walla, and then if you get way out to Pullman and into the Snake River Valley here, that get almost enough rain spread over the season that would sustain wine grapes without it. I don't know whose phone that is. I hope it's not mine. Okay. But this area in general, it's getting close to having enough rain, but the key is not what we get in total over the course of the year. Of course, the key is there enough precipitation, soil moisture at the growing season when the grapevines needed at critical stages of their development. And that is generally not the case anywhere in this eastern part of Washington state. Here's another comparison of rainfall. Here would be the Columbia Valley. Napa Valley, might be a surprise to some people, is much wetter. So they get, on average, enough rainfall to grow wine grapes without irrigation. But like I said, it might not always be there at the critical time of the year. Bordeaux gets a lot more rain, and on average, more than what the grapevines need. And it can be a problem that some years are just too wet in Bordeaux. It's just too much of these westerly winds. A bit more detail of warmer and cooler areas within eastern Washington. You can see in the Puget Sound area, in general, very cool. And you really have to look for the smaller areas that would be well suited for wine grapes. That would be those lighter, those pale green colors here. The dark blue is too cool. There's really no grape variety that would ripen sufficiently under those conditions. So there's a few spots along there, and there's today about 170 acres in that whole area here, close to Seattle, compared to 60,000 acres of wine grapes out here in the eastern side of Washington, where in general you can see it's much warmer. So we have many more choices of what grapes we can grow and successfully ripen east of the Cascade Mountains. Soils, much of the soils in eastern Washington are basalt, lava, old lava flows. They are thousands of feet thick. So that's the bedrock. And so in some vineyards now, that's actually where they're being planted. It would be broken basalt. Obviously very difficult to farm those. But in general, most of the area in eastern Washington, we do have some good soils overlaying that bedrock basalt, and those are either brought in by floodwaters. Those are silt, sand, and fine rocks and coarse rock. And then this wind-blown soil, the loess, which is some of the best farming soil anywhere in the world. So they are free draining. They are generally nutrient poor because we are in a semi-desert, so there's not a lot of organic matter in these soils, but the important part is they're free draining, but they do hold a decent amount of moisture when water is applied. A nice map to show you that fascinating history of these glacial floods from Lake Missoula that formed the soils, the basis for the soils in eastern Washington, but even all the way down into the Willamette Valley here in Oregon. So several times, maybe 40 times, maybe more, this lake here would fill up and then unleash huge amounts of water and sediment, of course, and scrub all of this area clear of soil and then deposit it mostly in this area in southern Washington, and then into these side valleys, as the Snake River, into the Walla River, Yakima River, because the waters were blocked from leaving right here. There was a plug in the bathtub. Once that was emptied, all of this water left, but it left behind a lot of sediment, all kinds of sediment, very fine to quite coarse. And then the wind came in, and it's still coming in every year, of course, in Eastern Washington, and it keeps sorting the soils for us. And the wind then created these loess soils towards Pullman. So like I said, most of these are flood deposits and then later rearranged by the wind. Here's a picture of this gap that initially blocked the water from these flood waters. And it took some time before the water then all drained out to this gap. This is Wallula Gap and the Columbia River that flows straight west from here. So this is what makes the soils today. Basically, like I said, there's a basalt bedrock, the solid lava, and then there's coarser and finer sediment, silt, sand, gravel above it. Sometimes it's very shallow, just a few inches or a foot. Most farmers would like to see 3 feet at least of some of this loose sediment here. So all this variation in elevation and soil gives us lots of opportunity for creating distinct wines from all these different corners of Eastern Washington. That's the reason why we can successfully grow so many different varieties, different than many other well-known areas in the world. We don't just have one red or 2 reds and a white that we're famous for. I think we can grow certainly a wide number of red grape varieties. Today, the most important red cultivar in Washington is actually Cabernet Sauvignon. It used to be Merlot some years back, and Syrah is catching up a lot. We actually grow more red in total than white in the last few years. It used to be the other way around until maybe 3 to 5 years ago. So quite a change. And then there's quite a large number of whites that we grow. Riesling used to be the most widely grown white grape variety. It is now Chardonnay, but we grow a whole bunch of other ones. I recommended a Semillon. I think that's a wonderful grape that's really overlooked. And Washington makes some wonderful examples of Semillon, also of Chenin Blanc, and some of those white Rhone varieties too. Sauvignon Blanc, of course, as well. And I gave an example of what people might want to try. But I thought for this tasting, it would be interesting to look at more the, whatever you want to call it, flagship varieties. Riesling for Washington on the whites, and then on the red, it's probably Cabernet Sauvignon and Syrah, and a lot of blends. Washington State makes fantastic red blends based on these 3 varieties, but we can also throw in a few other varieties there. I'm personally really excited about some of these other varieties that are minor varieties we're just playing around with. Like here's these Rhone varieties, the white Rhones, the red Rhones, make really great wines here in Washington State. Some of the Italian varieties, Spanish or Portuguese, a bit more Spanish varieties, Graciano or Grenache. That's the same grape variety. I think we make some unique wines from these varieties. So there's lots more excitement to come as we figure out where to plant these particular cultivars, how to grow them, and how to make these wines. So that gets me to the tasting. We probably should be there. How are we on time, Melinda?
This is great. Yep, let's go for it. Let's start
Let's
the
go
tape.
taste. And then we can still ask questions, please, during this time. So everybody has a glass of Riesling?
Sauvignon Blanc, it's still white.
Your preference, yeah. There's wonderful. What Sauvignon Blanc did you pick?
From Wente in the Livermore Valley of California.
Oh, yeah. Lots of good Sauvignon Blanc coming from there. Everybody's trying to make these New Zealand style Sauvignon Blanc. So we actually had a major research project still ongoing. How can we grow Sauvignon Blanc in Eastern Washington to make these two main styles of Sauvignon Blanc? One would be that New Zealand style, and one is a riper Sauvignon Blanc, more like, a European style. And a lot of it we can control by just irrigating. When do we give water? How much we give water? So enjoy this. This Riesling I thought is really neat for those who have the Riesling from Poets. It's the Poet's Sleep Riesling from Long Shadows Vintners. It brings two sides together. One is actually Walla Gap, that gap where all the floodwaters had to drain through to make their way to the Pacific Ocean. On the very top of that is some of the most spectacular vineyards anywhere. They're called the benches. And for Riesling, they're pretty important too. To me, these Rieslings up there bring some wonderful floral and mineral, probably some ginger spiciness out that I associate those flavors with some of the Alsatian Rieslings, which are certainly some of the best Rieslings you can find in the world. And for some reason, that region, that area up there on the very top of these hills, very windy place facing southwest, and it's like benches terraced. It's an amazing place to see. I do have actually some pictures. If we have time, I can show you those. That's one part of it. It's almost half of it. And the other part is from a vineyard in the Yakima Valley. Yakima Valley has several cooler sites a bit as you go west towards the mountains, or the Cascade Mountains. The Yakima Valley gets cooler and cooler, and these cooler sites make really nice Riesling. Those Rieslings tend to be ripe peach aromas and tree fruit aromas. So this is a combination of those two flavors. I think it shows it really nicely. It has a nice acidity, an okay sugar content. I'm not a friend of sweet wines. I like my wines completely dry. And one reason is that the sugar tends to cover up the fine texture of a wine. Only when the wine is dried, you really taste the fine acidity and some of the phenolics, the real texture of the wine. If it's sweet, you get sugar and acid. It's like having a candy in your mouth. It's not anything like a texture of a really high quality wine can show you. So this is nicely done. So I hope you enjoy that. There are some examples. We made maybe some of the very first, we being WSU in the wine program, we might have made the very first completely dry Riesling in Washington State. Dry as in zero residual sugar. Well, zero is 0.12 grams per liter, which is about as close to zero as the yeast can get it. Because all the other Rieslings at that time had significant amounts of sugar. That's one style. It was important to me to show you can make it completely dry, like a Sauvignon Blanc, which is, what a lot of people enjoy. And most Chardonnays don't have much sugar in there either. So where are we with time? We probably need to move on. I would say let's taste the Cabernet Sauvignon next. So this, I recommend it to try the Double Canyon Horse Heaven Hills, because Double Canyon is a winery that was founded and focused on Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Sauvignon from the Horse Heaven Hills AVA. And they continue to show how nice these Cabernets can be. The Cabernets from the Horse Heaven Hills are also very finely textured, I think, and this winemaker really does a great job bringing that out. They're not overly ripe and stewed fruit aroma. They're always a bit more restrained and sometimes even a little bit of an herbal minty character in them, which is very nice, I think, personally, but it's also nice because these herbal characters with age in the bottle turn into chocolate. And who doesn't like chocolate or dark chocolate? There's a lot of blackberries and black currants and a peppery character, a little bit of that spice character from the barrels, like cloves. Any comments, any questions to Cabernet? We grow Cabernet in a lot of areas now in Eastern Washington. Of course, that it's not a variety we could grow on the west side. We couldn't really grow it in the Willamette Valley in Oregon either. It needs a warmer fall to ripen. It's one of the latest ripening varieties that we have. Yes, please.
I have a question. I went to a premium wine tasting, and it was in the Walla. I think it was from the Walla, and it was the Columbia viticulture plain. And it was the most distinct, interesting wine I've ever had. And I'm like searching for it. So I'm hoping you can help me. But because of the basalt rocks, it had all the mineralization from that. And there was this really heavy sulfur head that sat on top of a red wine. And I've never had that sulfur punch from a wine before. And I was just curious if you have anything you could recommend with that kind of odoriferous sulfur experience.
Air. That's why we put wines in big glasses. This is not the biggest one I have. Bigger ones would do a better job. And give it some air. We tend to drink our wines too young. So one thing that helps is really having a big glass to allow a lot of air contact while you're enjoying this wine. If I have to guess, I would think it was maybe a Syrah from Walla. They make some very good Syrahs, and a number of producers really like to include a lot of stem, the stem of the bunch in those fermentations, and that gives it sometimes a bit of a sulfury or funky, peppery character. Actually, in the Syrah that I have for you, this Pundit here, there's about 15 to 20% stems included in that wine as well, because people like that texture and they like that aroma compound. Some people go to 100% though, so it's not, the fruit is not destemmed. The berries with all the stems go into a tank, and then you smush them underfoot. You really can't do it any other way to release the juice from those grapes, and you leave the stems in there to ferment with the juice and the skins, and that gives you some of these unusual flavors. That's a practice that's really only done with Syrah, maybe Grenache sometimes, but not with a Cabernet or a Merlot, for example.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So do you get that odor? Maybe some of that might remind you in that if you taste the Pundit wine, maybe you find some of that odor that you were describing.
I'll be curious if others do. I'm actually doing a wineless wine tasting right now, but
Oh, that's tough.
I'm having fun.
Are there any other comments, questions?
I've always thought it was interesting that they leave the grapes, the actual material and the stems. And I hadn't heard stems until you just said that, but the material, and there's a name for that. I should remember from my wine class, but there's a name for that kind of that floating material that is left on top of a red, that is kind of left with it. And then they take it out after so long, right?
Yeah. Generally for the reds, you de-stem the fruit. You take the berries off the stem. The stem doesn't make it into the fermentation. That's tradition, well, most common. But of course, a long time ago when we didn't have all the machinery, stems always got into the fermentation, right? Nobody picked those berries up by hand. Process of pulling the berries off the stems breaks the berries to some degree too, and that helps releasing the juice. So it's easier to get juice released, and then the juice and the skins and the seeds, they sit together and they further are enzymatically broken open to release flavor and juice. When you decide to leave the stems in there, you just load the whole bunches into a fermenter, and then you actually have to send a person in there with very clean feet, of course, to punch down these grapes, and that will then break the berries, release the juice, and then you can ferment the skins, the seeds, and the stems all together. During the fermentation, the skins will float towards the top, mostly because of the gas that's produced during the fermentation. And in all red wine making, you have to either push that cap, it's called the cap, back down under the juice to keep extracting flavor. And also you don't want to expose the cap to oxygen because that will then create microorganisms that will form acetic acid. And we don't want acetic acid in wine that goes into vinegar. So maybe you were referring to the cap.
To the cap. Yep.
Yeah,
I couldn't remember the name of it. Yeah, that's great though. Just just explaining that. I think it's interesting.
That cap can be very thick. I mean, if it's a big tank, you can't punch it down humanly. You need to have machines that push it down, or you pump juice over it periodically to make sure it stays wet and you keep extracting flavors from it. Yeah.
Nice. Well, we might be ready for the Syrah because I think we only have, if I'm thinking, about 6 minutes left.
I already poured the Syrah, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Mentioned it. Thank you for reminding me. Yep. I like this Syrah personally quite a bit too, because it strikes a really nice balance of some of these old world Syrah flavors. The Rhone Valley in France is famous for Syrah, the northern part of the Rhone Valley, which is still south of Lake Geneva, where the Rhone comes out, near like south of Lyon, is famous for all Syrah. As you go further south towards the mouth of the river, you get to the famous areas around Châteauneuf-du-Pape in Avignon, and that's mostly Grenache with some Syrah still. So they're wonderful wines along there. And so these Syrahs in the Rhone, they're typically made with a good proportion of stems included, that process I just described. And this is one of the wineries that group of winemakers that actually had two French consultants, well-known French wine consultants, working with the Saint-Michel wine estates red winemakers to create this style for Eastern Washington. So it must have been an exciting project to work with the Europeans, that they have a certain flavor preference. They know certain events that happen as fruit ripens there in the Rhone Valley in France, come to Eastern Washington and taste the fruit there and talk with the winemakers there. I'm looking for this flavor, I'm expecting this and that. So over the years, then they developed this style, picking fruit from 3 distinct areas in Washington. One is in the Yakima Valley, one is a vineyard in the Horse Heaven Hills, and one is actually at the Walla Slope. Maybe I should go back and show you where that is. So some of the Syrah comes from here, from the Yakima Valley, actually pretty far out here, a cooler side towards the western end of the valley. The other fruit, about a third, the Horse Heaven Hills, this edge here. And then the third part comes from Red Mountain, this little area here, which is some of the warmest sites we have. And then so they're each fermented separately and then blended together. So there's quite a bit of sublots that are being made, and then to create that flavor and texture profile. Here's, by the way, this Walla Gap that I mentioned. It's right here at the border with Oregon. It's fun too. You might be able to get the components. So for this Pundit wine, you can actually get those 3 components: the Yakima Valley Vineyard, the Horse Heaven, and the Red Mountain components bottled separately. It's fun to see what they taste on their own and then see what the combination does. It's a nice little blending study. It's really fascinating, fun. They're all 3 nice wines. Great.
I love the Syrah. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's so much potential we have with Syrah in terms of winemaking. We can grow wonderful Syrah almost down here near the Columbia Gorge. Certainly in this area, we grow this very warm area Syrah here. We grow it in Walla Walla. We grow it up near Chelan and even north of Chelan. There's some really nice Syrah coming from there. Different, they're all very different. And that's one of the joys of Syrah. Syrah is a great variety that really shows differences in where it is grown, how it is grown, and how it is made. So of course that makes it fun for winemakers to work with. It's never the same. You can create so many different variations and then blend all these variations together to make something that is close to perfect. How are we doing with time? Linda?
I think we're, about ready to probably wrap up, and because I have a feeling people are,
Yep.
But I really appreciate all this information. I think everyone I've seen in the chat where people have really learned a lot from this, and new terms and lots of things they didn't know, and it really has been a pleasure. So thank you.
Enjoy the wines. Thank you.
Will do.
Thanks for inviting
In
me.
a couple of hours when I get home, I plan to. Thomas, thank you very much. It was a great presentation.